Hi, folks, and thanks for joining us here at SomeFuture for episode 22 of our podcast. We're your hosts, Jack and Chris.
Hey!
Hi. What's up, Chris? All right, guys, today we've got some pretty interesting topics. On Present Futures, we'll actually be discussing the third industrial revolution and the future of government. On Paleo Futures, we will be discussing the life and work of Donella Meadows. And on FizBiz, we will be discussing investing in the Chinese Amazon, Alibaba. As always, we hope that you enjoy our show, and please visit our website and blog where we post our supporting materials at www.somefuture.org. Follow us on our Twitter handle @SomeFuture, or visit us on our Facebook page, or simply connect with us on LinkedIn or Facebook. We always welcome your engagement with questions, concerns, or ideas of things you would like to hear about on our podcast by emailing us at somefuturepodcast@gmail.com or by engaging with us in social media. So let's see what the future has in store for us in some future.
That's some future. Okay, great. So for my present futures today, I wanted to bring back a little bit of positivity. We've been away from the podcast for a little while. You know, there's been a lot of just, insane stuff in the news, and I think sometimes a little bit depressing. And when I saw this video, I felt positive. I was like, wow, this is the things that you and I talk about, right? And how technology and how generations and I think foresight and futures, kind of mix and can create a better world. I really do think that's why I want to be a futurist. I want to speak to futurists. I want to talk about this sort of stuff because I think there's a way through some of our problems. So when I see, a speech like, or a talk and a book like the one we're going to talk about, that promotes, I think, positive thinking, and brings a lot of these ideas together and says, hey, wow, this is how we can transform the world in a positive way. I'm all about it. So what am I talking about? I'm talking about both the book, but also the Vice documentary that came out. I think this was in October of last year or November, about eight or so months ago, the Third Industrial Revolution. So this is by Jeremy Rifkin, who actually we've brought him up in the past. Let me talk a little about Jeremy. So he's an American economist and social theorist, writer, public speaker, written 20 books about the impact of science and technology on the economy, the workforce, society, and whatnot. Recent books include Zero Marginal Cost, Empathetic Civilization, European Dream, as well as The End of Work, which I know I've brought up here when we talked about, how technology could, impact work and whatnot. So, so what's the third industrial revolution all about? So essentially, what Jeremy's talking about is, everything that we actually talk a lot about on this podcast. So there's a lot of things that are happening all at the same time, right? The price of food and energy is climbing. Unemployment remains high in many places all over the world, stubbornly high as well. Housing market tanked, consumer and government debt is soaring, recovery is slowing everywhere. The economy is not the same vibrant place it was. And, there seems to be a collapse, right? And before you stop and say, Jack, or it's Chris, what happened to the positive stuff? What are you telling me about the positive stuff? So Jeremy,
I'm a pessimist, man.
Yeah, well, exactly, right. So Jeremy starts to talk about a lot of things that we talk about, right, all the time. So he's like, there is this convergence of all these technologies that are about to impact human society big time. We're talking about the communication technologies that we're using right now, this Skype session, right? The ability to just create music or create, a radio station, like what we're essentially doing that and spreading those ideas out, converging along with the new energy paradigms. So of renewable energy, as well as, this technological development that's happening in places like transportation and the technical space as well. So you really have this convergence of all these things that are happening all at the same time, which is extremely disruptive. So he positions it as the third industrial revolution. So, let's think back at the first and the second, industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution, steam powered, started in the United Kingdom, really sort of set, I think, essentially the rails, if you will, because that's what happened, right? With steam engine. But it set the rails, set the foundation for our current society that we have now. The second industrial revolution, that's the electrical, revolution. So you think television, you think lights everywhere, you think, electronics, in your pocket, in your home, all these sorts of things. The United States was probably the primary benefactor of the second industrial revolution. But now that we're in this third industrial revolution, it's really a convergence of all these disparate parts of the economy that's sort of happening, all at the same time too. So this is, this is a future where there's hundreds of millions of people that are producing their own green energy from their homes, their offices, their factories. The fact that you can actually share that energy with an energy internet. So allowing to where you can have, and this is actually one of the books that it has, the zero marginal cost society, where you're not spending excessive costs on on anything that happens. And this even includes the transportation industry, right? When we're talking about autonomous trucking, autonomous cars, the ability to perhaps not use petrochemicals or hydrocarbons to power vehicles. It completely changes how society works, right? And so essentially, what Jeremy Rifkin positions is that this third industrial revolution is going actually to completely change how economics works as well. So, when we think about renewable energy, when we think about this new transportation energy, robotics, and then of course also in these other sectors that are still being born, right? That the slow job growth, the price problems that are happening with energy, the problems with food when it comes to pricing and transporting everything. The government debt is soaring. It's hard to do all this recovery stuff, right? But the third industrial revolution actually has an answer for all of this, and it's actually using all of these technologies properly and setting them up so they'll make an outstanding society. And he in this talk, he positions everything we talk about: 3D printing, renewable energy, autonomous vehicles, biotechnology, all these things that we talk about over and over again. He sort of morphs it into one big conversation. And one thing I really liked about the talk was he had people, not only, my age and your age, right? We're in our mid 30s. He had young people, people in their 20s, because essentially what he said was, the generation that produced the second industrial revolution, their mindsets may still be stuck in that revolution, right? The hydrocarbon and electrical era, the old school electrical era of fossil fuels, right? Natural gas and nuclear and all these things. But the new generation will have to pick this third, industrial revolution up themselves. Will have to help create this new era. So, I don't know about you, after watching it and I read a little bit of it, and I read a bunch of the interviews with Jeremy, I felt enthralled, because I was like, this is exactly what I needed to hear. There's been enough doom and gloom about, the end of American prosperity or the end of global prosperity and all these sorts of things. And it's so nice to see somebody who can kind of stitch together all the disparate things that are actually positive impacts on the world and can communicate it in such what I think is a solid way to get people have some positive energy about the future of, not only America, but really globally. So I thought this was a really great present futures to talk about. And I know we might even be a little bit, it's maybe not present because, it came out, such a long time ago, right? But I think I wanted to give it some oxygen because to me, it's just such a good conversation to have, especially in these, perilous times.
Well, I think it was a great thing to bring up, Chris. I think Jeremy Rifkin is an extremely intelligent man, and I think the thing is that he doesn't just have our admiration. He's got admiration of leaders of countries who are listening to him and following what he is saying. He's Angela Merkel, who he's talking to, who, Germany is instituting a plan based off of this. China is doing the exact same thing. They understand, and he even most in the video, he says, China understands that they were not involved in the first revolution. They're now just coming basically in first industrial revolution. Now they're just coming into the end of the second industrial revolution. And they really want to be one of the leaders of this third industrial revolution. And you can see that happening. They're, with all of the sustainable energies and all of these new technologies they're investing in. I mean, I think that's pretty neat. I think that one thing that he does start his conversations off with kind of that this is the worst that could happen, and then kind of gradually gets better and better, because he talks about how 40% of people in the world are making $2 or less, how 62 people in the world have half of the wealth of the world. We have the environmental crisis, sixth mass extinction. We literally have to be off carbon in 4 decades. If we are not, then he can't even imagine the implications. And I love that he talked about IoT, because I have an IoT company, and so I think he said basically that IoT is what's going to drive this industrial revolution. It will be driven by this central internet and sensors and IoT devices, big data, all of these things that, like you said, we talk about all the time. Mm-hmm. And it got to me because he would say, like, there's not going to be any more middlemen, where those 62 people are controlling everything. What's going to happen is that, social entrepreneurship is going to happen, is that, people are going to get equalized to these social means. And, technology has the capacity to make us equal, like that. Like, those are some of his exact words. I think that, one thing that's amazing to me is that he's had the influence on countries that they've listened to him, so much so that by like 2040, Germany is planning on having 100% renewable energy. China's doing something similar. I really think that, he talks about a lot of stuff, and then me being my pessimist, I'm like, well, I think there is the fact that he doesn't bring up social issues enough when he's talking about all these things. He is an economist, and just to not to poo-poo it, but just basically say, like, I think all of this is great, but then you have people like Donald Trump who thinks clean coal, and who wants to and people who have all this money right now, they're going to be fighting against this. Yeah, they're going to because they want to be able to control things, and I think that that's kind of it's a scary world out there still, but I'm hoping that I'm hoping this is the future. I want to see.
I do too.
He even says it. He's not a utopian. He says, I am not a utopian, but this is the way that it could go. Yeah, and I think that I would love for it to go this way.
Yeah, me too. And the other thing that I think is helpful here, and this may even answer some of the social questions you were having, right? The reasoning why there's this push and pull from the hydrocarbon environment and from the transportation industry and all these sorts of things, right? That may be the old second industrial revolution fighting against this third one, but I think economics is just going to happen, right? When renewable energy is cheaper now than hydrocarbon energy, it just is, and so it makes dollars and cents to actually sometimes go with solar, go with wind, go with tide, because we're getting to the point where the technology is so good that it's just plain cheaper to not drill 2-4 mile holes into the ground so we can transport this energy and use it in this other way. The other thing that I think is really helpful here, and it's something that we don't talk about enough, and I don't mean we. I think we discuss it on this podcast, but I think the American government maybe doesn't talk about it, is that the future of work is in the third industrial revolution. So what do I mean, right? So, we talk about it all the time, right? Robots taking over, the algorithm economy taking away jobs, all these sorts of things. What Jeremy's talking about is we have to build an infrastructure for the Internet of Things to work, for renewable energy to work, for wind turbines and solar systems and autonomous car plants and all these things. And robots cannot do the welding that it takes to, shore up the electric grid. Robots can't install the fiber optic cables that need to be connected all over American society. Robots can't install the Internet of Things smart home devices that need to be. There's so many jobs that are going to be unleashed. So really, the slow job growth really is it's the end of the second industrial revolution and the beginning of the third. And I think what's unfortunate, currently perhaps, is that, we maybe like you said, the power structures of the second are getting in front of the potential power structures of the third. And I think they need to meld, or they need to understand that, there's a way economically to benefit from these new technologies. And not only, this is exactly, I think, what the Republican Party talks about all the time, using the power of, market-based economics to unleash a huge growth rate to America. And I think it's in this. It's in the rebuilding of not only America, it's in the rebuilding or even building period of places like Africa, Latin America. This could just completely change the planet as this interconnected system that would really, I think, change the economic prowess of just about everybody on the planet. So it's a huge idea. And I think that's why it's just so important to talk about on our podcast.
Yeah, man. Well, so one thing I was going to say is that, I think that it sounds like an idealist philosophy, but I think that, if we were able to do this, establish an infrastructure. Look at the United States right now. We have like a 4% unemployment rate. It's super low, actually. Our unemployment rate, and it's going to continue to drop. And people are like, well, Republicans are saying it's because of Donald Trump, and Democrats are saying it's just because of this types of stuff, where these jobs are just going to continue to grow, and it will get closer to that 0% unemployment rate, at least for the next generation or two. But the thing is that, I worry about this social equation, and I worry about, what's going to happen with, all this hatred that we have in the world and all this, me first. And, he talks about how millennials don't really have that. And that may be true, but we all have our own biases and judgments. And I think what the real thing is going to be is technology is going to be this equalizer.
Yeah.
And that, how are you going to know to treat somebody if they have an online avatar and it's black or white or it's, whatever. And you can't tell like what age the person is, what sex the person is, what race the person is. You can change their voice to have a different accent. When you're interacting with people in that way, you can't, like, we are so quick to judge people. But if it's something like that and you're interacting like that, and this economy of IoT where everyone's going to be interacting with everyone faster than light, then that's going to be the great equalizer. And hopefully that's what that means, is that this is going to really bring the world more together. And that's what I would like to see out of it.
Yeah, no, one last final thought on this. One thing that I see that's a difference here, right, is when you look at the second industrial revolution, right, the going from the agricultural world to the industrial world to, I think, the service economy that we live in. We've been living in that service economy for a while. So while we have low unemployment, I think, there's also really low consumer spending. It's harder to actually save money. It's harder to make money. And what's the problem with that? Well, there was this huge industrial collapse inside much of the world, right? And we're automating. And that's the problem, right? Everyone's like, oh my God, we're automating, and all I have is these, crappy jobs at TGI Fridays or, working at Dollar General or whatever. These are low skilled jobs. What the third industrial revolution has is, in order to install fiber optic cable, in order to work in the business world of renewable energy, in order to be a solar panel engineer or anything like that, you need high skills for that, and high skills pay more money. So I think there's a way for so many bridges to happen, and like you said, there's a way to cut out the divide between disparages in, minorities with not having the ability to be a part of these economies too. So, there's a big chance, I think, for this idea to fruit in many ways, not only from the technological way, but I think maybe even more so in the economic way. And I think we have to do our best job at stewarding it. And if that means investing tax dollars, if that means positioning hydrocarbons towards renewables, or more effort towards autonomous, learning how to understand how 3D printing could affect us, all these things we discuss right on this podcast. We have to do what Germany and China are doing. We have to put force behind making this third industrial revolution a reality, because I think that is where not only the future of economic prosperity goes for the United States and the rest of the world, but I think for the future prosperity of us as a civilization. it seems like it's the next path, and I really can't wait to be a part of it.
Okay, Chris. I really wanted to follow up our conversation about the third industrial revolution. And as you could probably tell, I was a bit skeptical about the idea of us all working together to come up with a better world, even though I would love for that to happen. Because I think Jeremy Riskin said that, he even said in the video that we're going to post that, people are only out for themselves. I think we are able to have a sharing economy when all of our basic needs are met, and then we feel comfortable about sharing information, giving goods or services away for free, etc. But I think one thing he doesn't touch on, and it's probably, maybe it's because of his work with the Chinese, is government. So democracy or dictatorship. He doesn't mention the 62 people in the world who own half the world's wealth, about how many of them are actually in positions of power. Because this is a debate that is raging on debate.org and other organizations, and it will probably always be debated as long as society exists. The long story is short, and I wanted to postulate on world government and see actually which type of government is truly the best type of government to move us forward into this next period of human history. Because I wanted to talk about democracy, either direct or indirect, oligarchy, dictatorship, or maybe it will be something in between, or something we haven't discovered yet. So I'm going to give a little brief background on each of these, and then we can shoot it as we go. But I think if we look at like the earliest forms of government, there really were like monarchies or dictatorships in a way. It's probably the oldest form of government, really. One in which a powerful leader and sometimes his cronies, they take the power and rule over a population. There's been many different types of monarchies in the world. The foundation is very simple. First, we had those individual monarchies where the strongest or the smartest seized the power and then gave power to a small group of followers who ensured that that monarch or leader stayed in power. Then you had things such as like divine power, where the god or gods wanted that person in power, and they were able to control their population through that mindset. Nowadays, there really aren't many monarchies left, at least those who aren't mostly figureheads. When we think of monarchies today, that might still have some power. We think of a few countries in Africa, the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, and then maybe one or two in Asia. Most of these are ruled by a royal family who completely controls the state and who have the last say on most, if not all, matters. So what we have nowadays, though, into which monarchy has probably always been, but with the lack of religious superiority, is dictatorship. This is where we get to the real crux of my argument, is that while I'm bringing this up today, we are at a period of time where dictatorships are becoming more and more numerous, where it has become easier for an individual or a small family to completely rule over a population and prevent them from rising up, to only serve a small portion of the population's benefit. I'm thinking of Russia, I'm thinking of China, I'm thinking of Syria, I'm thinking of North Korea. It's these states that we see a burgeoning movement to completely control an entire population in order to impart, one man or select minority will on everybody. And it is here that I think we will see the next world war, which is why I love for this third industrial revolution to happen. But I think what's going to happen is there's going to be a world war, and it's going to be between these people in these dictatorship roles, these dictatorship countries that have one person in power, and these democracies that, to be honest, are fledgling right now. And it is and so I wanted to talk a little bit about democracy, and then I hand it over to you, Chris, to give me your insights on this. But yeah, so I think democracy, I'll give you obviously a very, very brief and not at all complete view of either of these. But so democracy and direct democracy, and then even socialism, I'm talking about for a little bit. So as you know, the U.S. is not a democracy. If that's news to people, then I'm sorry, but U.S. is not a democracy. We are a constitutional republic. And that means that we elect people to represent us in all matters, and we hope that they mostly vote on things we want them to do and about what we care about. As you probably know, republics have existed since the days of Rome and usually involve a group of individuals who are career politicians who may specialize and serve on committees where they should have the greatest amount of knowledge and experience in order to solve the questions and problems that face their respective nation. Specifically in the United States, we have an electoral college and a popular vote for electing our nation's highest leader. The Electoral College has been put in place to ensure that people who know the most about a country's politics or issues would select the best man for the job, even if it goes against the popular vote. which does not happen often, as we now have a way to track those who go against it, and they probably wouldn't be in power for very long if they went against their constituents. But we also have a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one branch of the government can truly rule over the others, such as the executive, the legislative, or the judicial. This is to prevent potential dictatorships and is most of the reason we have term limits. So that's a constitutional republic in a nutshell. We operate on a series of guidelines and precedents extending back to the founding language of a constitution or some sort of body of work, a living document, which obviously then is open to amendment, but it's actually very hard to amend. And so there's constitutional republics. They're actually very numerous around the world, as the concept of democracy, which was championed by Europe, spread through colonialism, and the United States, which was spread through colonialism and westward expansion. Per some arguments, constitutional republics are failing as you look to the inability for even our own government to pass simple legislation or truly convey the will of the people. So following constitutional republics, which are what most of the countries who claim to be democracies are in some form or fashion, it's fascinating to look at direct democracy. So we talked about dictatorships and what that could potentially lead to. But the closest government to truly have a direct democracy would be Athens. But even that was limited to Athens-born men who were landowners and excluded over half the population. I think we're now at a period in time where we can have true democracy, and I've even dabbled with the idea myself in my HOA, because I'm the president of my HOA, is that you have everyone in the community vote on every issue, and you go with the majority rule. Now, several political historians shudder at the thought of direct democracy, because that's why we have an electoral college. They believe that instead of most people being well informed on the issues facing their city, state, or nation, that they're mostly ambivalent and would vote, not realizing, they wouldn't even care. They're not realizing that the impact their vote may have. This may be true. I don't know. However, people who do argue for direct democracy argue that in a direct democracy, all votes count, and we would have true majority rule, and people would work together to solve problems. You have an elected official whose job it might be to educate the populace on the issue, but ultimately all issues would be decided by majority, and there would actually be very little power in the elected official's hands, making corruption very difficult to maintain, at least at a fundamental level. Now, there's a lot of questions regarding this. It's been through recent but I think that through recent technological innovations, that this has actually become truly possible. I don't think it was possible before really the digital age, but people are becoming more and more interested in that possibility. So, Chris, tell me, what are your thoughts on this? Do you agree with me? Do you think there's going to be this clash of ideology? What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, I think there's definitely obviously something in the air because, the idea of government and democracy, we've talked about it a lot actually in the last couple of months. Our previous podcast, we talked about it. And obviously I think the breaking down between, what is authoritarianism, what is, socialism, all these sorts of things, it's a very sober discussion to have. And some thoughts around it is, obviously you see the rise of authoritarian regimes, coming to the forefront. And I think too, there's authoritarian regimes that we just ignore because of economic capability, right? We discuss it, right? China has a very oppressive regime. Obviously, you look at North Korea, which is essentially the opposite in terms of economic capability. But you see how it's essentially a criminal syndicate with a psychological component because there's so much propaganda that's thrust at the people as well. And then you see, of course, the rise of authoritarian issues arising in typically democratic ideal places like not only the United States but obviously Europe as well. So there's I think there's some trouble right on the horizon when it comes to, what government is and what it's about. To me, I think what that means that we have to, first of all, we have to understand as citizens, civics, what it takes to be a citizen, what democracy means. We should understand, facts from fiction, I think. I think that's another dynamic that is impacting this, the rise of fake news, propaganda for causes. I was just listening to, this individual. He's former FBI agent, graduate of West Point, teaches at the anti-terrorism center. He was talking about, what he saw as the eventual usage of, fake news propaganda from Russia during the Ukraine Crimea extension pull, right? That's what actually drug Russia out of the G8. So what he was talking about is that he's actually not fearful that Russia is going to impact America with fake news. Why? Because America now itself, actors inside of America are creating so much fake news, which is causing a dissension amongst the people, right? So, and we could say that this could possibly even be a global pandemic, or not pandemic, but a global epidemic, right? Because the rise of fake news can really attack all different countries and all different sorts. So, I think we have to understand how government is supposed to function and actually prop it up as best as we can. And we have to make sure to not, we should, our better nature at all times, right? We have to always look at the truth and be able to look inside of ourselves, including our own parties, to see what works and what doesn't, right? It hurts my heart when I see, these authoritarian regimes rising, and these thoughts, the rise of racist and sexist and people who other so much inside of former democratic idealistic countries. I think that's the wrong message, the wrong direction. Now, futurists look at this in a very kind of expansive mode. You may see that there's cyclical stuff that happens. So, there's a major democratic ideal and it falls in authoritarianism, and eventually you will rise back up into that democratic ideal. And that may be something that just happens along societies along the way. From a futurist lens, it's just a part of the dynamics of society. I think, though, it's just the last gasp of, possibly even generations that still adhere to some of these, fantasies about racism, sexism, and, blind leading of authority. And so I'm hoping that the new generation will be more civically minded and will pay that much more attention to the truth versus, what it feels like in emotions. The truth is, to me, it will always set you free. Pay very close attention to it because it'll definitely lead you to the promised land.
Chris, you have these unscrupulous nations, these people, think of it about North Korea. So, he's a young guy, he's in his 30s, and he is, the way that he talks about, I can't imagine, like, if he were to die or get assassinated and thought like it was his last breath, but he was the only one with his hand on a nuclear button, and he, starts World War III by just nuking everybody because he's like, well, I'm the last one alive and I'm the one that matters, and he kills, and he dies, and he kills everybody else along with him. That's the scary thing, is that there's not only that, there's also, the idea of technology being used as a weapon. You see it already happening with hacking into democratic elections. And, it's that this idea of democratic freedoms is being eroded. And that, the people who don't have any issues with it are the ones who are going to triumph because, they have no moral compass. And, it's the idea of fake news, like you said, but, even going deeper into that, technology being utilized to create fake videos because that's already happening. You have this technology that can replicate people's faces and their voices, and you can create fake videos and fake other things that, have been used to, I think Russia was really trying to divide our society by supporting Donald Trump because they knew how divided our country was already and wanted to really cause an issue and, implant almost a Manchurian candidate who's really hurting our view from all the other countries around the world and, hurting us as the idea of a superpower.
Yeah.
And I'm extremely concerned about the future. Is China and Russia is building kind of together now to, say, oh, well, because China's premier just became premier for life. So, basically becoming a dictator himself. And, I see that happening. And I think that it's going to be, these democracies are going to have to fight. And I don't know if they're going to win in this next war.
Well, and it's great to position as that, right? So it's a war, right? But this isn't the other war that we're used to, right? We're used to bombs and projectiles and, eliminating infrastructure and stuff like that. And by the way, that still can happen, right? But we're in a cyberspace war, but we're specifically actually in an information war right now. So, and the ability to soil, what this gentleman was saying, the ability to soil the differences in America could cause dissension, and so one thing I don't even know about this, and so this maybe not be a futurist topic, but it's interesting to talk about how ideas can actually be catalysts for change. So there's actually a book. It's by Alexander Dugin, and it's The Foundation of Geopolitics. He wrote this in 1997. In this book, he talks about the best way for Russia to ascend to a power is actually to break apart the Atlantic Treaty, who essentially is the West. So break apart the West as best you can. Wanted to separate the United Kingdom from the EU. Wants to separate, lots of countries inside the EU. Wants to, pretty much annex Ukraine and create more stability across the nations of the Middle East, as well as, places like Estonia and Latvia, which were previous Russian strongholds, because it would prop up Russia as, a major world power. Keep in mind, this is 1997, so it's pretty, for futures studies thinking. I mean, this guy was very forward. And one thing that's really important here. So, and if you go back to what I was just saying, right, it's already happening, right? UK through Brexit has been separate from the EU. There has been dissension happening with far right authoritarian, fervor attaching itself inside the EU. Now, of course, that's happening because there's Syrian refugee, problem. There still is Muslim extremism, Islamic extremism that is sort of happening as well. But all those things came up, through many different mechanisms, right? One other thing that Alexander Dugin said was the best way to actually to proceed with this Atlantic Treaty disintegrating was to create, I kid you not, it's in the book, racial dissension inside of the United States. That was the United States' fundamental flaw, and the best way to divide Americans was to create disorder and chaos within the social structure. And they could do it a lot of different ways. They could do it through the racial disorder, political disorder, as well as catastrophe. So creating fear. So and literally, this is actually what the Soviets used to do in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, during the Cold War. Essentially, this was the model that they used to kind of create a fear disorder inside of America. So it's just so from a futurist standpoint, Alexander Dugin's it was pretty right on. So what is that? Was it a weapon or a tool for the state in order to promote really the end of democracy in the West, to make a more multipolar world? So Russia can be a part of that world, maybe, right? I can't say that for sure. But it's good to note that. And again, these are facts. This is a fact-based thing. It's a book you can read. You can read about it. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This actually was out there. It's something to understand. So, we have to, if we want to keep up the American ideal, we want to, reject authoritarianism. We want to ensure that we have the rule of law, and we want the democratic ideal to function. We actually have to understand the facts on the ground. We have to, force ourselves away from any nefarious stuff that we receive either through social media or through just positive, or just through, any social means of expression that we have in the United States. And we have to understand that, there's a greater thing here, right? It's not just me versus you. It's actually us as Americans. That includes everyone. That includes people who are undocumented here. That includes failing cities like Chicago with gang violence. That includes the Rust Belt that's having issues with drug disparity and lack of job growth. So we have to come together as a society, not only in the United States, but even across the world, and combat oppressive authoritarian divide with truth and solidarity. Truth and solidarity will be able to combat it, I think, as best as we can. Okay, great. So for Paleo Futures this week, I've got Donella Meadows, which is actually really great to bring a female perspective on the podcast. We are in the Me Too era, and I always like to bring prominent futures, right? Futurist to to the podcast as best as we can. And actually, we get to one of my favorite, so Donella Meadows. One of the reasons why she's my favorite is because she's a systems thinker, right? And actually, one of the first to bring systems thinking to the forefront in the late 60s and predominantly the 70s when she did most of her work. So a little bit of background on Donella. So she was a Pew Scholar in conservation and environment, and she was a MacArthur Fellow, so one of the MacArthur Genius winners, and was really one of the preeminent and most influential environmental thinkers of the 20th century. So she received a PhD in biophysics from Harvard. Later, she joined a team in MIT that was applying systems thinking and systems dynamics, something we've talked about on this podcast before, to global problems. So she's really known for a book called The Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972. Sold more than 9 million copies in 26 languages. And then she went on to author 8 other books. They include Towards Global Equilibrium, the Dynamics of Growth in a Finite World, Groping in the Dark, The First Decade of Global Modeling, Harvesting 100-Fold, Key Concepts and Case Studies in Environmental Education, Global Citizen, Beyond Limits, and Limits to Growth, a 30-year update. So, quite, I don't know if you could tell, but she seems to have
right now.
she seems to have a theme, right? And what her theme is really known, to be thrust about anyway, is, she really cared about the environment, and she saw the earth as a holistic system. And so she used systems thinking, which is, using systems modeling to understand how things either grow or regress, to be able to, speak on the environment, right, and trends, right. So, looking into her first book, The Limits to Growth, which came out in 1972, she was a part of this MIT team who created this global model called World 3 for the Club of Rome. And it looked really in the long-term global trends in population and economics and environment. And, it really caused one of the first debates when it came to how humans were going to interact with their environment, and how not only the burgeoning population growth that was going to be happening, which was going to change the dynamics of Earth, but also how economics and the environment were going to maybe cause a catastrophe. And really, that's what her work, post Limits to Growth, was really all about. It was about trying to understand how, we could use resources properly, environmental conservation, sustainability as best as we can, so we can have a sustainable Earth. And what I liked about Ms. Meadows' work is that because she had such the pedigree, because she had the PhD in biophysics from Harvard, and she worked with MIT, and she used systems thinking, which actually is it's a combination of qualitative but quantitative measurements as well. She put the science behind sustainability. She put the science and mathematics behind taking care of our environment. And I think what you see when you listen to her lectures, when you hear her passion for the earth, a couple things stand out to me, and I'd be interested to know what you think about her in just a little bit. But one thing that I saw is that she tried to analyze as deep as she could the almost impossible problem of balancing resource acquisition, resource usage, and of course environmental sustainability and whatnot. So she rigorously analyzed whole systems, right? These complex systems, so she could see how we could build a self-sustaining Earth for all levels of society, from local to global. And I think she did it, and I think maybe too, because she was a woman, she did it with some sensitivity, class. She's a very humorous person as well. So I'm really glad that we got to bring her ideas to the podcast, because sort of an unsung hero when you think about sustainability. And, I would say there's probably even a lot of environmentalists that, might not know who Donella Meadows is. And so I'm glad she's getting her day, at least in our podcast.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I think she was actually, I think she'd still be even more prominent today if she was still alive. It was unfortunate that she died at such an early age from that bacterial infection in 2001. I think that I don't know if you read Limits to Growth, but I think that was really, you're right. It posited how much the world, like human economic expansion, could grow, and how this machine that we have, the constant machine of growth. What are the limits? And what are the limits to what our planet could sustain, and what are the limits that humankind can understand, society can sustain? That's really important. And then she went on to found several things that are still around even after her existence, like the Balaton Group, which obviously then focuses on the sustainability, resource use, environmental conservation, and the systems modeling that you were talking about. I think that's a group that's still around today. That they meet Hungary every year, and they talk about these things. When they were first meeting, it was kind of not even really there was nobody really doing it, and now there's so many people who are doing it and talking about it, and it's people like her and her in general who really got this idea going.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, so, and I'm glad you actually brought up, her unfortunate passing in 2001. Obviously I think she still would be a great voice for Earth. I was going through the DonellaMeadows.org website. I kind of was, kind of taking a look at, some of her writing. She was a teacher also at Dartmouth as well. So following her PhD at Harvard, she taught at Dartmouth all the way actually to her passing in 2001. Really had, I think, a passion for speaking truth to power, and the separation between where we can go. And one thing, I don't know if you saw a couple of the YouTube videos that I put up, but one thing she always spoke on was we can't just grow the economy despite the Earth, right? That was a major theme that she discussed. The best way for a sustainable society to keep going was to pay very close attention to how we use our resources, pay very close attention to how we exploit our resources also, and, do it in a scientific way to where, society will be able to sustain itself for not decades, but, millennia to come. There's a couple quotes here that I really do appreciate, and I her saying, one of them is, this one is really great. The Earth has no way of registering good intentions or future intentions or high hopes. It doesn't pay attention to dollars from a planet's point of view. It's just a charming human invention. Planets measure only physical things, energy, material, and their flows into and out of the changing populace. And I think it's good to frame it that way, right? That the planet, it doesn't care. It doesn't care about us. It doesn't care about money or Instagram likes or, the stock market or anything like that. It is a unique system, in this, pretty unique solar system, right? And we have to do the best job we can as stewarding it. And it's really great to have futurists with a healthy outlook that aren't just, I think sometimes too, we look at futurists as these fantastic people that have these fantastic ideas and, oh, well, that would be great and wonderful, right? But also, futurists are seen as, qualitative people and they just track stuff and what does it matter if they are just, talking about information because, in the end, there's no meat behind it, right? There's no mathematics, there's no scientific analysis, anything like that. Donella did both. She was a futurist who, was a conscientious person who thought about the Earth holistically before it was cachet, right? Before it was cool. And she did it from a scientific, way, from a very holistic way. And, I can't say enough about her and her place in future studies.
Want some money?
time for FizBiz.
FizBiz. Let's do it.
Yeah. So as always, I wanted to preface this segment with our old age adage. These opinions are solely our own, meaning you are responsible for your own investment decisions, and you should pretty much take everything, and I mean everything, we say with a grain of salt. As in, believe it or not, Chris, we are not all seeing gods or geniuses like Alibaba.
That is completely true. I'm not an all-seeing god or genius.
So speaking of which, that brings us to our topic today, Alibaba. So Alibaba, if you don't know what Alibaba is or who Alibaba is, well, first off, they got the name from the Middle East. So, the Tales of Aladdin, Alibaba. So that is China's, and by some measure, the world's biggest online commerce company. So it has three main sites. It has Taobao, Tmall, and Alibaba.com, which literally have hundreds of millions of users. And they host millions of merchants and businesses, and they handle more business than any other e-commerce company in the world. It is the most popular destination for online shopping in the world's fastest growing e-commerce market, China, which also has one of the world's largest populations. So that's no surprise there. So transactions on its online sites totaled $248 billion last year, so more than those of eBay, Amazon combined. So that's 80% of China's online shopping market is actually dominated by Alibaba, and is now looking to the U.S. and other countries for expansion. So if you're tired of Amazon, or you might soon have a new competitor with all the trappings of Chinese communism tied to it. Meaning, so if you look back at it, so it first, I think, entered really a U.S. perception back when it did its U.S. IPO. And actually what it did when that happened was it raised $25 billion in its IPO, which is pretty big, but its total market cap recently was explained as having $215 billion in market cap. So it's a pretty big business. It's not any small by any means. So it was actually started by a gentleman named Jack Ma, who I'm sure I know you're familiar with, Chris.
Yep.
But so he was a former English teacher in China, and he actually is no longer the CEO of Alibaba, but he still has a lot of say in what goes on there. It's actually him and members of his previous corporate structure. They actually nominate still more than half of Alibaba's board members. So he only owns about actually 8% of the company. What's interesting, and you're going to get a kick out of this, so Yahoo owns about 16.3% of the company. A gentleman named Joseph Tsai actually owns 3.2%, and then 40.3% are owned by others. And then SoftBank, I don't know if I'm sure you're familiar with SoftBank, the Japanese investment conglomerate, owns about 32.4%. We also have to remember they own large portions of Yahoo. They have an influence over about 50% of the company.
Sure.
So it's more than just an e-payment platform, though. They have their hands in many industries, including owning a portion of a share of Alipay, which is the top payment service in China, which has 50% of the market share. It also owns 60% of a large movie studio in China, 30% of Weibo, which is, you're familiar with Weibo, it's like their Twitter, Facebook type social media platform. And then they have it's their social media channel. And then they have numerous other companies such as AutoNavi, UC Web, Jiahusan. So they're extremely popular in China. They have a lot of influence in China, and they are moving into other markets. So my thing is that I'm going to say is that, what we have to look at competition. So obviously, if you look at competition, China has Tencent and Baidu, and even to a lesser extent, JD.com, which is the second largest e-commerce platform with about 19% of the market share. Those are its main competitors. Tencent has its own payment platform. It does its own e-commerce. They're trying to get, really, it's not really gotten off it's not as nearly as popular as Alibaba. So, those are their major competitors. If you look at them, it's funny that they're all supported by the state of China. They're all, supported by, and so, if you look at all of this, state-run technology transfers and things like that. That's something that comes up. So, Chris, tell me what you know about Alibaba, and maybe posit. I'm going to put you in the position of somebody, maybe an average American. I know you're not, but tell me about what an average American would think about what they might know about Alibaba.
Well, I think I'm for sure average, but for sure I'm the average American, right? We just happen to pay attention a little bit to this stuff. There's two companies. You said one of them, when you were talking about it. Two companies that I think of anyway when I think of Alibaba. The first one is another A company, right? Amazon, right? All Americans know Amazon, right? And we know as Americans that Amazon is the number one retailer, almost literally on the planet, probably, right? Their ability to grow, as well as their expanse into so many different industries and their disruptive nature has actually caused Jeff Bezos, their CEO, to be the richest guy in the world, right? So, I think if people are confused about Alibaba, and of course you may be, it's because they're unfamiliar, because this is a Chinese website, right? It's a Chinese commerce website. But if you want to, frame it in your mind, what is Alibaba? It's just China's Amazon, essentially, right? It's a way for, people to purchase, goods and services online. And what makes it obviously different is that it's in China, and hey, they have the scale and system that is so much broader and greater, right? So, and even I'm wondering if there's been any sort of comparison, right, between the reach of Amazon and Alibaba. And matter of fact, I mean, there is, you could see it, but one thing that's interesting is that there's so many people not only inside of China but inside the greater China region, right? So we're talking Vietnam or Mongolia or some of the older Soviet countries, right? So it's bigger than the 1.3 billion people they have in China. It's actually might be closer to 2 billion, and we think that Amazon's power is in their commerce ability, the ability to sort of scrape the commerce dollars through low growth but high volume in the United States. Well, United States plus maybe Europe, maybe some parts of the world that use Amazon. The United States, though, as the primary purchaser for commerce for Amazon, it's only 350 million people, right? So, what it just tells me, right, this is FizBiz, so as an investor, is that Alibaba certainly, this is again just the beginning. I have noticed their growth rates. I think they're growing at 0.9%. To Amazon's 0.4%, which is very telling. And of course, because they don't have the republic system that we have in the United States, which is how Amazon is being sort of corralled. And of course, that's a part of the issue too with Amazon when you think about them, because of Jeff Bezos, the fact that he owns the Washington Post, and the Washington Post writes negative articles about Donald Trump. There's a little bit of friction between the behemoth that is Amazon and Donald Trump, right? The political work there, because of the state-controlled. It behooves the state of China to make Alibaba as profitable as possible. So again, this is, and we've talked about this, right? The difference between the Republican system that we have in the United States versus the state-controlled systems of China. You have a different sort of economic dynamic and a little bit more things at play. So I think if there's one company to get people to think of as what is Alibaba? What do they do? Think of Amazon, but think, they're the Chinese Amazon, and then think, do they have the ability to grow as fast as Amazon? I'd say that's a yes. Is there a little bit more, runway or greenfield for them to explore? Probably, most probably. And I think the difference is the fact that they have the backing of the Chinese government, which wants to make them as successful as possible, versus, Amazon, which, you may even have, more legislation, regulations coming against them from, both sides, both the Democratic and Republican Party, especially as America finds its way to capture more revenue for its its troubled infrastructure. So I think for sure one of the companies to think about when you think about Alibaba is Amazon. I think it definitely it helps the average American think about what this company is all about.
Well, you mentioned some very good things in there. You mentioned scalability because the Chinese people are they're still just getting all on the internet. Like not everybody in China is still on the internet even. And also as they get more purchasing power, as their GDP continues to grow, then there's going to be more purchases and they're already expanding internationally. I mean, you can buy things on Alibaba here in the United States. So you brought up the Chinese government. Well, the Chinese government, the way it works right now is that there's a very little regulation preventing Chinese companies from coming into the United States. It's still very difficult for American companies to get into China without technology transfer and other things like that. So those are significant issues which hopefully our current administration is going to try to address. But the long run of it is should you invest? As for most of the companies that we feature on here, the short answer tends to be yes. The long answer, I think, is probably no. First off, I'm concerned with investing in any Chinese company, especially one that is it's alarming a lot of regulators and politicians in China. And it could at any time be subject to the Chinese regulator wins. I mean, you could say the same about the United States, Donald Trump's, personality going back and forth. But, China basically has that sole person in power who, if Jack Ma says something or does something to annoy him, Alibaba could be, a thing of the past, even though it does have an American IPO. I also think, because of that U.S. IPO, I don't think you can be fooled. I mean, this is a Chinese company that benefits from state-run technology transfer and which features a lot of fakes and knockoffs on its website, that could basically make it banned from a lot of democratic nations that have IP concerns. I mean, those are real issues that are being talked about right now in not only in American politics, but in European politics and other countries' politics as well. So invest, I would say, yeah, because of that scalability and because of the potential that it has. I mean, right now the company has a huge support from the state of China. It has a vast market, like I said, of potential customers, and it's really just going through it's only been around for I think 10 or 15 years, and it's expanding into international markets like India. I mean, that's the world's second most populous nation. It's already there, but I would be extremely cautious if it falls out of favor with China or with international regulators like the United States or the European Union. But still, I would say that this is a safe bet as it continues to grow and may potentially rival Amazon. At least here in the United States, if it's allowed to.
All right, guys, we're going to start with our futurist part of our podcast today. So we have Ross Dawson on. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Ross, and then we're going to jump right into it, Ross. So Ross Dawson, he is a globally recognized as a leading futurist, keynote speaker, strategy advisor, and best-selling author. He is founding chairman of Future Exploration Network and Advanced Human Technologies, a professional services and publishing firm. He is author of 4 books, including the acclaimed book Living Networks, which foresaw the social networking revolution, the Amazon.com bestseller Developing Knowledge-Based Client Relationships, and most recently, Getting Results from Crowds. Ross travels the world helping organizations think about the future, having delivered keynotes, executive workshops, and academic lectures in 29 countries across 6 continents. He has worked in senior positions in London, Tokyo, and Sydney, most recently at Thomson Financial as Global Director of the Capital Markets, as well as for Merrill Lynch and NCR. And he speaks 5 languages. So you're a very busy man, Ross. So I just want to thank you for finding time to meet with us today. Or should I say, gracias por tu tiempo.
Great pleasure to be part of the podcast. Thank you very much for inviting me.
No worries. So we got you on the show because for a number of reasons. Obviously, you've covered a lot of different topics. So we know that you do that in your futures work. So we've been on a bit of a kick for social futures, and we really wanted to get you on our show to discuss where the future of government is headed. Earlier in the show, we discussed different forms of government and possible futures of where we could be headed. So to start off the show, Ross, in your opinion, where does it look like we're headed? Are we headed for autocracy, oligarchies, more democratic republics? Give us your view.
So, well, first point I make is that if we're looking at the future of humanity, looking at the future of all of us, the future of government is one of the most important issues we face because it provides a whole structure for our society. It can be block, it can enable. It is one of the key things if we're looking about this view of how it is we create a positive future. And I think I'd like to start with, I suppose, where I think government should be going. And perhaps we can sort of look a little bit about where it might actually be going as well. So I think the core of what the future of government could be and should be is that it actually starts to dissolve. At the moment, we're seeing this boundary between citizens and governments as different things. So citizens, they pay their taxes, they vote, and then the government just does a bunch of stuff. And hopefully they get it right, and obviously mainly they get it wrong. But what the role of government is to create a better society. And for that, at the moment, the government, we've got all of these, I don't know how many millions of people and trillions of dollars being spent, often very ineffectively. So that we need to step back and say, what is it that we want? We want, for example, that we have health services provided effectively. We want that the least advantaged people have an opportunity to be able to have support. We want to have, defense of the nation. There are all of these things which can be objectives which we want. Now, there's many of these things can be achieved by citizens. And I think many examples of this are in healthcare, where, for example, one of the big things in healthcare is we are moving towards community support. A vast proportion of the cost of healthcare is people with long-term chronic conditions. And rather than people going into hospitals to have things done for them, it is far more effective to have community support them. And we can find ways where we can pay or support community to be able to help each other in ways which are far more efficient than government as a institution, as this this whole big system being paid money in and inefficiently spending that money to get that done. So we're going to potentially see government be far smaller, but this thing where the functions of government, that is creating a better society, something which is distributed, it is done by the crowds, it is done by the many, where we have far more efficient structures to do that. And the rise of the platform economy, which we've seen with everything from Uber and Airbnb and Netflix and hundreds of other examples, being some of the mechanisms where we can start to match efficient providers of help or services or care, whatever it may be, with those who need to receive that, rather than this institutionalized, inefficient, old way of working with of government today. So I think that government should start dissolving, and the boundary between governments and citizens should start blurring almost to the point that government as we know it today dissolves and we can't even perceive it anymore.
So I think it's interesting. You talk about social change a lot, and I've watched a lot of your videos and your keynotes. I think I have to ask. So do you think that this is going to have a positive or negative effect on how people react and create the governments? Like the social change that you see, is it going to be? Is it ultimately? Obviously, we would hope it would be positive, but what do you see in the near future? Is it going to have the negative effect that some people fear?
So, I suppose coming back. So this is, I suppose, part of the vision. The long term. I think we by necessity because of fewer resources for a whole lot of reasons, we will start to see government become more dissolved. But I mean, taking a step back to closer to the present, there are a lot of the political structures of today which are very clearly dysfunctional in many countries around the world. And this is essentially, we have a representative democracy. Representative democracies in most of the major developed countries in the world. And what we are seeing is because of the amplification through social media, amongst other domains, we're seeing this amplification of signals and the ability, which are actually pushing polarization. Now, the essence of most forms of representative democracy is that is the candidate who has more than 50% of the vote that gets in. So 50.1% makes you a winner. You then represent the entire body of people who have voted for you and in many cases have not voted for you. So this starts to, and so in times that becomes, of course, you get the whole structures of how do we divide the pools of people and the ways in which the representative are combined and inadequacies around that. So we start to see that, for example, we might have 50.1% of people who are lukewarm positive about somebody and 49.9% who are terribly against somebody. And this is creating this representative. And in this world, we are seeing the signals of, I suppose, which are shaping people's influence, which are more and more shifting from traditional media through to distributed media and social media, and this amplification of the ways in which people see it. So it is possible to game the system. And we're seeing many people being game the system. Of course, discussions in the United States, where there is not only people who are looking to be voted for, but indeed players from other countries who are trying to influence the politics, influence the way people are shaped. And so there are some deep structural flaws with this representative democracy structure. Yet again, if this the whole truism, as in, democracy is the worst form of government except for everything else.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we were actually just having that conversation with Andy Hines about this and the future of capitalism, and I think I want to mix that in a little bit here, because when we talk about future of government, obviously the social structures, how we care for our fellow man, whether that's through the social safety net, whether through healthcare, whether through public services, that's obviously extremely important. But of course, we're in this paradigm of capitalism structure. You have to have a job in order to live. There has to be an incentive in order for profits to be made, and the government acts as a facilitator slash arbitrator when it comes to free market economics. So I'm just wondering, how does capitalism mix into this end of government sort of ideal, and what will that future look like as capitalism becomes, or it shifts itself into maybe perhaps a new form that we didn't have before?
That's a very interesting point, and this idea of broadly post-capitalism, this capitalist structure, which have been a foundation for the last century and a half of modern history, which is we are starting to look at what goes beyond that. Now, there is absolutely this role of government in regulation, and there are some that's in both in terms of just policing our society, in terms of laws. You don't kill other people, you don't hurt other people, or whatever other regulations we agree on, and we have a system to enforce that. So similarly, the debate is around in terms of corporate activity or business activity, in terms of other outside the civil space. What is it that is allowed? What is it not allowed? And so clearly, we have companies that are dumping highly toxic things into our backyards or our streams, regulating against that. So that needs an enforcement. We do need to draw the line, and we do need to be able to have the regulation. So this is part of the way in which we're obviously seeing shifted. Government ultimately should be an expression of social opinion, and that's why laws change. Is that we have one is the legalization of same-sex marriage in many countries around the world over the last 18 years. I think it's around 26 countries that have legalized same-sex marriage, and that is a reflection of changing social attitudes. Essentially, the majority of people in the past thought that was not an appropriate thing. Now, basically, polling in many major countries say that the society believes this is an appropriate thing, and the regulations are changing to reflect that. So government is then a vehicle of being able to express public opinion around what is it that is acceptable and what is it that is unacceptable. So this interesting point goes to the policing then. So again, we're looking at this idea, how much can be crowdsourced or distributed through the population? Is it possible, for example, have a police force of citizens? Highly dangerous in terms of getting vigilantes and so on. But in terms of this transparency, being able to drive essentially reporting and regulation of business activities, that is something which, again, whilst the regulation is part of the role of the government as an expression of public opinion, then that then can be potentially be policed by, to a significant degree, the citizens and those who are participating in the economy.
Absolutely. So, and I think I was reading some of your blog posts on what I think is a tool for maybe stamping out this government corruption, and at least one of these tools I think is the blockchain or the distributed ledger system. One thing I think that the neoliberal governments, as well as the more autocratic governments, you just name it, what type of government is out there, there is always going to be the potential for fraud, waste, and abuse of government services, sort of in that. So the blockchain actually, it could be, along with, cryptocurrencies as a way of doing, exchange amongst the populace, could be a way of taking away that power by actually, opening up, creating transparency when it comes to, big government contracting and or how public services are paid for, how, just generally how government operates, right? As they collect taxes, will we actually be able to see where our taxes go? Or at least, that is the dream of a blockchain, perhaps, right? So I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on what the blockchain may do for the future of government, and if you see any maybe unintended consequences along the way?
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a land of promise, though I suppose the hype around blockchain sometimes short circuits some of the realities of, amongst other things, systems design. So blockchain by itself doesn't solve the problems. It's how it's implemented which can solve problems. And of course, the data which goes into the blockchain needs to be valid data. And that's also something which is not often addressed in the sort of the dreams of a transparent system through blockchain. But there's a few layers to this. One is in terms of simple record keeping. So, for example, to identity, and that's a very important role where being able to have identity, which can be corroborated by government authorities and taxation officials and so on, is it provides a very effective way to be able to maintain that system, and increasing governments around the world are beginning to either implement or explore possibilities of using this as an efficient, incorruptible view of everything from land records to identity. Next part is in terms of being able to look at it in terms of a trust system. And for example, as you mentioned, and being able to use it for monitor transactions which have happened, and being able to make sure that this you can't modify those transactions. You can't go back and corrupt systems because there are multiple copies of the ledger. However, this does not necessarily provide a solution to government corruption, because there can still be things happening behind the scenes. You can't necessarily see the nature of decisions, but it does provide further transparency and a way to be able to essentially provide a foundation for the transactions and the communication within the systems, which are the foundation of government. Now, a really interesting piece, I think one of great discussions around the role of cryptocurrency in relationship to the fiat currency of today, which are issued by governments. So we no longer have gold-backed currency. We have currency which is essentially the faith in the government that it will be able to stand by that value and repay that. So cryptocurrencies, as they currently stand, are obviously a disruption or a threat to that, where essentially a distributed system, no one at the core, people have a medium of exchange, which is no longer can be controlled by the government, or depending on the implementation, can no longer be monitored or tracked. So this raised the question of what will happen. At the moment, we're seeing many governments around the world, China, Russia, amongst others, being able to ban or to block or cryptocurrencies because of their threat. But we're also seeing this idea of how currencies will start to evolve as issued by governments. So the foundation for currency is a medium of exchange, and one where ideally the government can use this as a role of economic control through, for example, money supply. Yet what we are seeing now is that we have already moved on from having fewer and fewer coins and pieces of paper or plastic in our pockets to be able to pay for things, and moving to more digital currencies. And there does come a time when there is the potential for governments to start issuing digital currencies as a replacement for the current US dollars or Canadian dollars or British pounds or whatever, what they may be. And various other treasuries around the world are looking at this possibility. However, these would not be cryptocurrencies. The cryptocurrency is a form of ways of essentially being able to hide some of those details. And I think that it is very feasible in the long run that we will start to shift to digital currencies being issued by governments, potentially on blockchain. However, quite likely outside the characteristics of the ones today. The degree to which we will see non-government currencies traded and cryptocurrencies moving forward is a deep uncertainty. At the moment, it looks like governments still have the ability to be able to block effective use of these cryptocurrencies on a major scale.
And that you brought up some interesting points, and one of those is that I wanted to touch on is you mentioned several different governments and what they're able to do to stop these types of social change and to almost in a way corrupt the systems that they currently are in, say the Chinese or Russia with their types of government. I mean, what do you see? Do you see that as the future of government, that governments are becoming more and more, I guess they're really getting down on their citizens? I mean, you have these facial recognition technologies, you have these things that they will basically be able to control their citizenry. Is that the way that you see the future of government heading? Or do you see it, I mean, I hate to say it like the utopian Star Trek version, but do you see a more positive or a more negative outlook on what will happen with the government?
Well, that's essentially one of the biggest questions we face as a society. And so, of course, the answer is it depends, in particular, not least on which country you're looking at. So China is currently the poster child for the pervasive surveillance of their citizens. And one of just, I suppose, taking a slight detour around looking at the future of China, for a long time, essentially there are two very broad scenarios for the future of China. One is that it continues, there's more or less continuity, as in we start to have, essentially, whilst we can transition from different governments, we don't see it continues to evolve. The second scenario, in the broad sense, is there is a major disruption. The government is overthrown. The country breaks into pieces. We start to see essentially a fragmentation or a fracture in the economy and the political system of China. And then that is very feasible. I mean, of course, in many possible ways. So, and what is interesting, if you just look over the last 20 plus years, and from Tiananmen Square and many of the I suppose challenges to the government over that time, is that they have essentially been successful or even very successful in continuing to maintain deep government control over society. And of course, that being founded on their ability to see increasing prosperity through the country. And that's the bargain which Chinese citizens have accepted, is that they don't have individual autonomy. There's only one party they can vote for, but they do have an increasingly prosperous society. And I think very interestingly, another side note there is that the pollution levels in Beijing have come down dramatically in the last 6 years or so. It was at a point where the citizens said, this is, we aren't prepared to live in the city anymore. And the government acted. They moved, they shut down manufacturing plants. They put pollution emission controls on. They actually made a significant impact. So that's quite different to Delhi or Mumbai, where atrocious levels of pollution in a far more democratic country, but it's far more difficult for them to be able to respond to that and create that level of pollution control. So in this case, the Chinese government is saying, yes, we have control, but we realize our citizens will just push back if we are not creating the right thing for them. So it's not just increasing prosperity, but indeed we will act to reduce pollution and create a better life for our citizens. So, but this is still this Faustian bargain where essentially the degree of surveillance, and you're probably familiar with the social credit score in China, where essentially they're monitoring absolutely everything about people's activities and saying you are a very positive contributing member of society and part of the political system, and you will find it easy to rent properties and buy things and get your children into the right schools, or you're actually not a very good social citizen for various reasons, and you will find disadvantages throughout your life, which is a deeply dystopian world. In many ways, it's hard to sort of frame that in a very positive sense. Yet that is what China is becoming. It is the example globally of that kind of deep government control and surveillance. And it's, as I said, unless we see this fracture in the future of China, that it will continue, and we will see arguably everything happen on this deeply transparent level. Just as a quick side note, I've just read a book, the latest book by Nick Harkaway, Gnomon, Gnomon, which is beautiful, beautiful book. And it's framed in the future of United Kingdom, where absolutely everything is transparent to the degree that the government can come and actually look inside your brain to see what you're thinking. But this provides, on the face of it, an extraordinarily happy society where good things happen, people are able to do what they want, and it's a very functioning society on the outside anyway. So coming back to saying, all right, well, that's China or other countries or Russia where we don't have this autocratic governments. Now, the degree to which we see pushback in the citizens of democratic countries, such as Western Europe and North America, most notably, is one of the big questions as to whether I think we as citizens have given away our privacy to far more than we could have or should have or even we could have envisaged from 20 years ago. It's kind of just sort of thing, all right, okay, don't like it that much, but I'm not going to worry about it too much. And so governments by their nature, and the government as an institution, you can anthropomorphize it as something which does want more power. The nature of government is it wants more power. And I think that all governments, as we've seen in with what various of the initiative of the NSA, which again government leaders has since then disavowed, have just been saying, well, our role is to know stuff. We want more. We want more. We want more. We want to know more. So until we get that effective view of the citizens as a resistance to actually flow through into the way in which government works, that will continue, and that's one of the deep uncertainties facing us.
Well, and you bring up something that we were just talking about in our podcast. We were talking about. Well, I proposed the idea that I think that we're headed for a conflict with these autocratic governments, the Chinese government, Russian governments, where it's the power is no longer in the hands of the people. And to some extent, democracies are the same way. But we would hope democracies become more democratic, while these other countries are becoming more rigid and more controlling of their populations. And one thing we suggest is that there will be basically a war on ideologies. And there will be, on one side, there will be these governments that are, taking care of and watching all of their people and, building up these profiles, these social profiles, like what's happening in China. Do you see that conflict happening? Do you see that's the way that the world is headed, or do you think that we'll find some sort of mutual solution, or will we continue just to go into more and more of a security state?
I'm a natural pessimist. Sorry, I'm a natural optimist, and I'm always trying. That's my natural optimism. I'm also trying to be optimist in the sense, unless we visit a future, then we won't be able to create it. So we have to be thinking about what is possible in the future. But that being said, we are in a networked economy, seeing this amplification of forces of polarization, and that's happening across, wealth, across income. We're seeing that across, access. We're seeing that, in terms of, what's happening in entertainment and a whole variety. And we're seeing that in government as well. And as to the degree to which that plays out in this, I suppose, reversion to a new form of Cold War, as it were, we have opposing ideologies which are completely utterly opposed and hitting each other is I think very real. But the other thing is I think it's difficult to look to a world where on one side it's quite easy to see your China's and potentially Russia's and some other autocratic governments move to ones of as complete control as possible, aided by technology. It's difficult to see the opposite happening in democracies because of both the power of technology, the desire of technologies to use that. It's the idea of participatory democracy, where people are actually controlling what has happened at a local level, which is people are controlling smaller issues, which is best manifested today in Switzerland through their cantonal elections and on smaller issues and so on, is less likely to happen. People are still happy to delegate, the people want to control. And I think that the most positive scenario is not that we have some democratic bliss in some of the countries that we like to point to as exemplars, but ones where we see that shift to autocracy being limited through this rise of democracy. I think the most positive we can have is that we start to not have some utopia of true democracy, but we do contain and limit as much as possible that rise of government to one which is in control.
Yeah, I'd kind of like to explore a little bit of that idea of, the less government, less need of government. This is an idea that's sort of in the kind of post-capitalist community. One calls it, the resource-based economy. So in essence, you go ahead and you treat the earth as as a spaceship where you're able to access all the resources. 3D print houses, vertical farm, food for folks, create a technical utopia, if you will. Now, of course, one of the things that people say about this is that, who is in charge of the machine, right? Who's in charge of the networked resources, and how can we ensure that, our overlords, be they robots or be them, very astute, intelligent folks like Elon Musk or Oprah Winfrey, steward us as properly as we can. So I'd kind of like to talk a little bit about, as we approach less government and as we approach perhaps maybe a more technically automated environment, so where we may need less sort of stewards, less managers who can muck up our government and in turn muck up our society. How do we, sort of placate the worries of the populace to ensure that they don't have to worry about this AI or these, these folks being charged of it, but also ensure that nothing goes wrong as we try to, automate or, network our world or, create the best smart government that we can? How do we ensure that people aren't frightened by, giving the keys to our robot overlords?
So I suppose some big questions there, and I think coming back to the simple definition of platforms is a structure which links external producers and consumers using open infrastructure and governance structures. So when you have a platform, that is to be able to link, for example, resources or capabilities or workers, whatever it may be, with how they can be used. And the governance structures in that platform, ones which mean that you don't try to get people who are freeloaders or hurting people or allowing the right providers and so on. You have some rules and regulations around that. But if those are designed effectively, you can have a platform which is then simply an enabler of bringing together the right people. So this doesn't necessarily require this whole big mighty overlord. It simply requires the effective design of the governance structures of the platforms, which is an enabler then of those right connections of resources going. And coming back to so it's on a post-capitalist society. It's interesting that I come with a capital markets background. And my perspective on effective capital markets is that capital goes to where it has the best financial or social impact. And that's a good capital market. And at the moment, we have very inefficient and effective capital markets in the broad sense, or certainly not as nearly as good as they could be. And that there are all sorts of wonderful startups and ideas and initiatives and programs which are not getting the right resources, and there are many which are horrible and terrible and destined to fail, which are getting a lot of resources. So this is there's many issues underlying this in terms of transparency and visibility and assessment and visibility of the system and so on. But and having the mechanisms which make it easy for money to go to where resources generally being able to go where they can have the best impact. But this is again, if we are looking for a future where government starts to dissolve and play a lower place, we can relatively simply predicate that on being the right platforms with the right governance structures to be able to make sure that there's the right ways that the resources, the money, the people, the capabilities do get matched with how they can have value, create value in society or financially in the best possible way. And that's what the structure where, and again, one of the big moves now is to move to a cooperative platforms. So instead of Uber or Airbnb or others owning the platform and being the rent seekers and making a lot of that money, to ones where collectively we create these platforms. And that clearly is what government is or should be, the one that creates the platforms to match together things which are value creating for all participating.
No, absolutely. I think you really captured that pretty well. I'm actually going to turn a little bit here, and I want to think about the social aspects of government. I picked up Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel again. I haven't read it in about a decade or so, and it reminded me, about this conversation that me and Jack were having. And one of the positions of that book is that human beings we sometimes form groups kind of based on a strong man or a chief or a leader who we think for whatever reason, be it hereditary or just sheer size, right, is going to be able to propel us in the right direction. And you see this a little bit when it comes to government figures, strong men, autocratic leaders. I think you could see maybe Donald Trump, in the United States, or a Putin, or a Duarte, or Erdogan, kind of doing this in this mold. Do you think that there's something embedded in humanity that we're going to have to get away from, that maybe eventually might go away due to technology or due to social maturation, that will kind of get us away from the strong man or strong leader or strong person who can come in and take us across the promised land? Because again, we could get rid of less government, but if we still have leaders in this government that are nefarious, they may be able to move us in nefarious means. So is the humanity inside of us, is that going to be too tough of a hill or mountain to climb as we try to find less government out there?
Again, a very big question. And I think, broadly, we can frame thinking about the future as a sense of what is it that is fundamentally human and won't change? And what is it that will change or is changing or could change about us? And we're seeing these reflections now of, I suppose, changing social attitudes in terms of, different cognitive styles from, those who have grown up, with technology and so on. And I think what we want to believe is that we will evolve in our, as you expressed it, social maturity. And that we will, as we have more, I suppose, able to control ourselves more, potentially able to modify our genes, potentially able to, believe we have greater control of futures, that we do have this, belief in. And in broad social good and participation, my guess is, to answer your question, is that many people will still want to see somebody in which they can give trust, or they trust to be able to guide our futures And I don't think it's foreseeable that we will move away from this autocrats or people who a large portion of people start to have faith in. That's something I think we need to move against. We need to be able to educate or change, or to be able to provide structures which move away from that. But I think it's a deep question, one which we can't know. I think the current indications are that there is still a human propensity to pass over responsibility, essentially, to someone else who we say will take that for us. And that is indeed I suppose, a description of what we're seeing with many of the leaders that you mentioned a moment ago.
That plays right into the question that I had for you, Ross. This will be our last question. I think, obviously, we as a people, we're naturally corruptible. We've discussed on our podcast artificial intelligence and such things as artificial intelligence governance. So can you imagine a world where we have undisputedly fair AI government that would ensure this truly fair system, or come up with this system that would be the best for the most people involved?
It's a wonderful question. And so I'm a big fan of Buckminster Fuller, I think one of the great visionaries of the last century. And he believed absolutely that we would move to basically computer governance, that humans were fallible, no good at it, and that essentially AI would be able to do a far better job, would devolve it all to them. And the way that if we look into the current frame around AI, so what we're seeing is that in a defined domain, we have, in many cases, the ability of machine learning to exceed human capabilities in decision making, but that's always in a defined domain. So one of this whole question around generalized or general AI is whether we can move from that capabilities within a defined domain of activity or action or decisions to one which can be applied across domains where that machine doesn't previously have experience, potentially. And that's it. We have new social situations, new ways to be able to make judgment. And I think that's one of the big debates currently amongst pioneers and experts in AI as to whether that kind of general AI is conceivable in the foreseeable future. And I tend to think that it is to envisage, for certainly the foreseeable future, that an AI which can start to be, intelligent outside domains which it has been exposed to before. The whole machine learning, which is really what has driven this most recent progress in AI, is you give it masses of data, and then in a similar situation, it can be able to work out what the most likely is the rest moving forward. So that's one point. The other point is that we will always disagree with our leaders' decisions. So whether it's Trump or Clinton or Obama, whoever it may be, there'll always be a lot of people who say, that was dumb, that was bad, that was the wrong thing to do. And if it's a human, we can blame them. We can say, string them up or whatever. You can say you put them in prison, lock them up, whatever. You can have somebody to blame. But if it's an AI, don't. And that's part of the thing about working out what is the liability for when a self-driving car hits somebody, or a whole array of other issues around when it is, what happens with AI responsibility. So I don't believe we will be prepared to give AI responsibility for running the nation or any part of that, because we need somebody to blame, and that comes too fraught. And I could be wrong in the sense that I think one of the very interesting trends, developments, is the degree of faith which we place in technology. I think we actually forget how much, and I think one of the big causes of that was Y2K. Where essentially there was so everyone said, oh, technology is going to go wrong, and then nothing happened. And everyone said, oh, well, actually, we can trust technology. It's always going to work. Doesn't matter what's going to happen. Technology will always be there and always going to work, which I think is a problem. And so it is possible that we will start to, indeed, our trust in technology will extend itself so far that we will start to say, well, okay, more than happy just to get in a car and trust that it will drive me without having a human there, to extending and that extended types of experience like that, to say, well, actually, we will give our trust to things where it's, things like running the economy or, making decisions around, defense strategies or whatever. I think it's a long haul and it's a long way out, but it's still conceivable given that trend of trust and technology, which is continuing to advance.
Well, this has been an awesome conversation, Ross. I just wanted to thank you for your time today. But before we end our discussion, I just wanted to give you some time if you'd like to mention or tell our listeners where they can hear more from you, or where they might be able to find your books or anything that you have coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So rossdawson.com is a repository of all of my work. So I'm actually just building up a lot more content there. I have a lot of videos of my speeches, a lot of, over a couple of thousand blog posts. And during this year, I'm going to be building up a whole set of resources around futurist resources. What's happening with futurist studies, how to be an effective futurist yourself. And that's really the subject of my next book, which I'll be working on and be sharing a lot of content around that, around how is it that we can think effectively about the future and to create something better tomorrow than we have today. So rossdawson.com is where all of that can be found.
All right. Well, thank you again, Ross. And I don't know what time it is in Australia right now, but we appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Ross. It was great. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.